Hello and happy Worm Day. It's not officially Worm Day, but it is for you because we've got worms. This is a follow-up to a recent one where we had a preparation video at Castlebank and found a palaeoscolecid worm fossil. And we've been itching to get this into an electron microscope to see what it's like. And it turns out what it's like is very, very interesting indeed. Hello everyone and welcome back. I'm slowly on the mend after my little shoulder accident, and so normal service will be resumed at some point. Now this is a video that I thought for a little bit about putting into the members section, but then realised we don't actually need to, because there's nothing here that anyone can scoop us on, and it's not going to be a high impact paper or anything like that. But it's still a really interesting little addition to our knowledge. And since it's a follow-up to something that you ought to have already seen, I thought might as well put it out for the general public. So, here we are. We are talking palaeoscolecidans. Now, for anyone who has not seen the previous video, going way back, look in the description, there'll be a link there, on palaeoscolecids, you might want to watch that one first, because it gives you a general background into what they are, why they're interesting, and how generally amazing they are. And it is very amazing. In case anyone hasn't seen that though, just a very brief sort of recap of what they are, what it's all about. So palaeoscolecidans are a group of Cambrian to Silurian worms. So this is fairly ancient. They appear very early in the Cambrian and they go extinct in the late Silurian as far as we can tell. They are normally quite elongate, cylindrical things, surrounded by loads and loads of little, what look like segments, basically annulations in the cuticle. And those annulations are ornamented by minute phosphate plates. Now these plates can be absolutely gorgeous things, but they're normally 30 or 40 microns wide, more or less. Some are much smaller, a few are bigger. And so you need an electron microscope to really look at them properly. Even better though, the plates are embedded into a cuticle, which is also phosphatic, at least partly, made of microscopic, sort of micron scale microplates and platelets. And the whole thing gives you this incredibly exquisite ornamented cuticle, which it used to molt in order to grow. Now, as for where they fit into evolution, they are believed to be, well, they are ecdysozoans, so they are in the major group of all those phyla of animals that shed their skin to grow. And they are probably including the ancestors of lobopodians and other arthropods, and various groups of modern worms like priapulids, probably nematodes, nematomorphs, and possibly pretty much all of the ecdysozoa go back to something that looked like a palaeoscolecid in some form. Now, all of those modern lineages have evolved in different directions and have lost their palaeoscolecidiness. There's nothing alive today that has this plated cuticle in the same way, and so they are an entirely extinct group, but they don't fit into any modern single phylum. They're all sort of in this general mishmash at the base of the evolutionary tree for these phyla. Now, there are quite a few Cambrian records of palaeoscolecidans. They turn up in most of the Burgess Shale type faunas and also in phosphatized faunas, which you dissolve out of limestone and get bits of cuticle, where you can have really exquisite preservation. And they're known in the Cambrian even from isolated plates, which can be dissolved out. They're quite distinctive plates, and those turn up in every continent. So we know they were a diverse and widespread group in the Cambrian. In the Silurian, there's hardly anything. There's a single described species based on entire sclerotomes from the late Silurian of Shropshire. And then there are isolated sclerites from China, Welsh borders, and also, I think, North America, maybe, and a few others which are probably Silurian palaeoscolecids haven't been properly described yet, from the US especially. In the Ordovician, it's somewhere between the two. The thing is, in order to get a well-preserved palaeoscolecid fossil, you need exceptional preservation. They need to have been buried rapidly and then preserved in such a way that they haven't completely disintegrated. We get the isolated plates very commonly, if you dissolve the rocks in the right way and look for the tiny things. But to get the entire sclerotome, where you have the plates, the microplates, the platelets, and their arrangement, which is also critical to the taxonomy, then you need some sort of rapid burial. And that's fine. And we do get rapid burial in quite a few places, but less commonly in the Ordovician than in the Cambrian. So we have a much more scattered record. There are quite a few species described from Bohemia in Czechia, Czech Republic. There are a few from China. There are about 10 from Wales and the borders. And there aren't many from elsewhere. They're just the odd isolated one here and there. A few from Morocco now as well, but not many. And most of the diversity is actually in the Bohemian ones, which is through the entire Ordovician section, a few isolated occurrences, and mainly in Wales. In fact, 7 of the known species from articulated sclerotomes have been described from the Bill Thinlayer, which is where we happen to live and work, and oh, there it is over there. And there are also multiple other ones that we haven't described formally. There were just a few fragments. And now we have Castlebank, where we originally said that we thought we had 5 species. That's what we put in the announcement paper. We now think it's closer to 20 or more. And it is a diverse fauna, and every single one that we look at so far has been gorgeous. So when you find an extra little specimen on almost live on camera, it was certainly one that we found while we were filming, and it looks like it's got nice detail. You can see the plates in these little annuli, and you can show that just with an ordinary light microscope. We are really itching to get that into an electron microscope and see what detail there is. And it turns out, in this case, yeah, there's a lot of detail. There's a great deal of detail indeed. But to start with, we need to know a little bit more about the taxonomy of palaeoscolecids. So, there's actually not much to say. There has been no formal sort of classification, analysis, or even just sort of intellectual assessment of how different palaeoscolecids are related to each other beyond the absolute basics. There are 2 families. That's it. Well, almost. There's also the Mautianchaniidae, which was erected for Mautianchania cylindrica, but is probably, I think, one of the Palaeoscolecidae, and it's not a widely accepted family. And then there's the Tylotytidae, which is a slightly odd group, which has spines coming off the plates, quite long ones. So, yeah, I'm ignoring the Tylotytids, but yes, they should be in here as well. Anyway, moving on. We have the Cragocosmiidae, which are a unique group known only from South China, maybe North China now, but only from China, and only from the early and possibly into the Middle Cambrian. And they have relatively few plates around an annulus, around the circumference, sometimes only half a dozen or so. And these ones are the group that are thought to be very closely related to the Lobopodians and hence to arthropods. Everything else is in the Palaeoscolecidae. Now, this is a bit of a dustbin family. It includes a huge diversity of form and detail and sculpture and ornament, but they have certain things in common. There are some basics. Some of those basics are that they are annulated, sometimes less clearly than other times. So there are quite a few taxa which you can't actually see finely divided annuli, but you can still see rows of plates around them. And the plate rows are normally a few dozen plates in an annulus, but each annulus is composed of 2 rows of plates. Those plates are either circular or elongated, and they can be quite sort of strikingly elongated, almost becoming a long thin rectangle, and they're ornamented with tubercles, little lumps basically. Now those lumps can be in various arrangements. Quite often there's one big one in the centre and then some around it, but it's basically an array of lumps of various arrangements on a rounded, either circular or elongated plate. And that's about it, really. There are some novelties, And a lot of those novelties are from the built-in layer. So some of the phosphatic stuff, the Cambrian rocks in Australia, for example, do include some really weird morphologies with sort of crenulated edges to the plates and all sorts of oddities like that. Some of them in the Ordovician of China actually start to reduce the number of plates and have a much more regular microplate and platelet cuticle, sort of very regularized sort of meshwork structure of plates sort of arranged in a rhomboidal pattern. And these are distinct from ones you get anywhere else. That group is only found in China. But in the built-in layer, we have a few weird things. There is a thing we call palaeoscolecid, which actually looks like a feather. It's completely lost the transverse annuli, and it seems to have longitudinal things instead. And then there's Wernia. Yeah, Wernia is a fun one. It's got a fairly standard arrangement of annuli with rows of plates going around it, but those plates don't have any tubercles. They've got arrows on instead, so at least we know which direction they're going. Except we don't, because the arrow direction alternates from one row to the next. They are pointing inwards to the intercalation, the line between the annuli. So you have within an annulus, you have two rows of these plates with arrows on. The arrows point outwards in each case. And they're very consistent. They are nice, clear arrows. I mean, yeah, it's a bit weird. There is nothing else even remotely similar to this that has ever been described. And then you have the cuticle, which is also utterly weird, because the cuticle here is not a sheet covered in microplates. It is a net, where the microplates slot into the spaces in the net. So you end up with a polygonal cuticle covered in microplates, but they're embedded into these spaces in what looks to be genuinely a porous, net-like cuticle. And that, again, is not like anything that has been seen elsewhere. And we'll come back to structures of cuticles later on, because it's an interesting thing, but this is a unique feature. And you have that and these unique plates that don't look anything like what we see in other palaeoscolecids. You start wondering, is it even a palaeoscolecid? Is this something else entirely that is just pretending to be a palaeoscolecid? That does happen, as we know all too well from Castlebank. That's a story for another time. But in this case, we had nowhere else to put it. It looks like a worm. It's got cuticle that looks like a worm, and it's only when you go in with an electron microscope that you see it's just weird. So, you never know what you're going to turn up when you put a worm into an electron microscope. And it turns out in this case, we turned up some quite unexpected and interesting things. So in SEM, this one turns out to be kind of extraordinary, because it's not often that you find something in a fossil that is a clear intermediate between something you know and something else that you know but you don't know what to do with. And here we have a palaeoscolecidon, very clearly. It's got plates which have tubercles, and those tubercles are superimposed on an arrow. It's got Wernia arrows on the plates. It's just that it's not just arrows. There are tubercles, and the lines actually join up some of these tubercles. There's also extra ones, so there's one behind the arrow. It's a really regular arrangement of tubercles. And those tubercles, in some cases, define the arrow on the plate. So it is very clearly a Wernia-like worm, but it is not Wernia itself, or at least it's not that species, and it has these tubercles on it. Amazing. Now, one thing that's quite striking about the arrows, and indeed this arrangement here in particular, is that the structure on these plates is extremely regular and asymmetrical. It's got a front and a back. We know which way round it is because it's kind of an arrow. It's pointing in the right direction. So normally on palaeoscolecid plates, you do not see that. Each plate has sort of irregular arrangement of tubercles, and if there's any symmetry at all, it's broadly radial. You cannot tell which end is the front and which is the back. There's no orientation to them in general. I think there are a few examples where you have sort of elongated ones which are slightly wider at one end than the other, and that gives you a little bit of sort of an asymmetry. But here, the arrangement of the tubercles is consistent. It's really rigidly defined, it seems, and that's an unusual feature of these things. Not necessarily totally unexpected, but it's unusual. So we have here something which is showing that Wernia was at least closely related to ones with tuberculate plates, as you get in other palaeoscolecids. It also has this beautiful network cuticle, which is really nice to see, so that's a consistent feature. And in fact, it looks like that cuticle is a more reliable feature to define a group than the plates are, because there's quite striking differences between the plates, but cuticle is similar. And we can extend that as well, because we looked at a few others, and one of those is this thing here. Now, this is another palaeoscolecid from Castlebank, which also has plates with tubercles set into this reticulate network cuticle, and again, those plates are very asymmetric. It's not arrowed, there's no arrow marking on there at all, but it's kind of like you take these plates and tilt them a bit so all the tubercles fall off towards one side. So you can see that we have got asymmetric tubercles again, and they are pointing again into the intercalation. So the tubercles are all shifted towards the outside of the annuli, pointing towards the intercalations. So we have almost a really lovely sequence here from a standard, if you like, palaeoscolecidon through to Wernia. Almost. We've got these very derived forms in Wernia. We've got things with asymmetric tuberculate plates, and we've got an intermediate between them. So I'm happy that that is a sort of continuum. It shows the range of morphology within an evolutionary context. But we still have, in all three of them, asymmetric plates, and this weird net-like cuticle, which we don't really see elsewhere, do we? I've been going through the literature a bit, trying to find ones which show something similar, and the only thing I can really come up with is a thing called melaculum, which doesn't have the same sort of asymmetry, but the plates are indeed asymmetric. They're sort of triangular, wider at the outer end, narrower internally, within an annulus. And one other thing that's really interesting is that they are alternating. So they are almost interlocking between each other, which is rather nice, because that is something that we see also in this new thing that looks like Wernia. And possibly also in Wernia itself, but I think the cuticle was a bit distorted, and we didn't focus on that when we described it. So I'd have to go back to the original photographs and SEM images and see if we can confirm that. But melaculum, at least, appears to have asymmetric plates, which are relatively well constrained. They have a lot of detail which is consistent from one plate to the next, and they are clearly oriented. Now, it just so happens that melaculum also has a reticulate cuticle in exactly the same way. Again, we've got in very few examples where there is articulated material of melaculum, but this paper here, we can clearly see it's got exactly the same network cuticle that these plates are embedded within. And that's really interesting, because I've been looking for other examples that look even vaguely like the cuticle we see here, and that's as close as I can get. So it looks as though this is a combination of features which do co-occur within one group of palaeoscolecids, reticulate cuticle and these asymmetric plates which are offset and have a very well-constrained morphology in the ornament and the detail of the sculpture. Now, we could be wondering whether this is some sort of taphonomic effect, that you happen to get these species which are preserved showing the cuticle in one orientation, and we're just seeing the underside or something like that. But it would then be coincidental that we only see this reticulate network as a cuticle in this group, which seems to show Wernia-like tendencies. So this could be potentially the background for sort of subdivision within Palaeoscolecida, Palaeoscolecidae, a different family, creating a new one. But what does this reticulate cuticle even mean? And for that, we have to look for other structures that show some sort of network pattern, work out what the microplates represent even. And there was a paper by Wang et al. Who were comparing not quite the same structure, but polygonal ridges on the cuticle in Palaeoscolecids with the underlying cell structure that you see in the cuticle of modern priapulids, which are thought to be close relatives. And there they came to the conclusion that it was a very strict relationship between the two, that the microplates and the ridges in the cuticle in which these are set are an expression of the cell structure that you see in the epidermis of priapulids. So it's an extension of the cellular arrangement in the skin of priapulids that leads to these sort of micro-ridging effects, leading to a reticulate pattern, which then forms the basis of the microplates. So the individual cells within the cuticle are then secreting the phosphatic bit to create individual microplates. And that is rather nice, but there's no sign there of how you go from that sort of ridge structure on the cuticle to a porous network where there are spaces in the middle. So you can imagine that sort of thing happening somehow, that this is an extrusion of a softer cuticle layer that isn't preserved, or if these are molts, that just isn't part of that molt. That's entirely plausible, that the whole animal, the cuticle, would have been preserved, because this is Castlebank, where we get things like cilia-like structures. So there's no reason why the lower levels of the epidermis wouldn't be preserved. But perhaps we're only seeing molt fragments so far, and so the outer layer of the epidermis is being shed, including these cuticular modifications. So maybe that's what we're looking at here. It's going to need a lot more work to look at the distribution of different types of cuticle patterns within different Palaeoscolecids, look at the whole range of diversity that we have here to really understand this. But I think we're getting to the point now where there is scope for actually getting a handle on some subunits, subgroups within the Palaeoscolecids that have not previously been recognised. So we're starting to be able to tie in different parts of Palaeoscolecid diversity with at least other members of the same group. Whether that will allow us to tie them into members of different phyla, for example, in the modern, is entirely up in the air. We don't know that yet. And it would probably need a lot more work seeing if there was anything similar in modern forms, for example. But we're working on it, and we've got some quite nice material to be able to do this now. Part of what we're going to need is a much better understanding of the taphonomy, the preservational pathways that led to these fossils. And I just want to finish with this one by looking at the taphonomy of this particular specimen, because although we're not going to go into huge detail, it's really, really interesting. Because Castlebank, we are preserving soft tissues. We're preserving bits of material that are purely organic, normally rot away, and for whatever reason, at Castlebank they haven't. There is evidence of pyritization going on in some places, and there is evidence of pyrite being lost secondarily. But we look at this specimen, and you can see there is a taphonomic gradient going along it. It's not the same all the way along. We have plates at one end which are pyritized, and then at the other end they're just molds. The pyrite is gone or wasn't there to start with. And there's a transition somewhere in the middle. And somewhere around that transition, when you zoom in, you see that there is not only the change in the plate structure, mineralogy, preservation, but also that when you go to the molds, you start getting the network of the cuticle around it, which you don't see where you just have the pyritized plates. So we've got, within this one specimen of a space of a millimetre or two, we have a difference in the preservation, which is pretty systematic. There is a consistent pattern going on here. And this pattern, I will just say, ties in really well with what we think we've worked out based on all the other material that we're looking at. So it's specimens like this that can really help you to tie down how the preservation is working. And we think there is a chemical process that was going on a small scale that led to the preservation of organic material and is related to the loss of pyrite. So it's really nice, and I'm not going to go any further into that because that's something we are still working on. But yeah, it's a nice little story, and this is all from one little black thing on the surface of a rock. Less than a millimetre wide, about half a millimetre wide, and a few millimetres long. And we're getting all this information out of it. And that is the joy of paleontology. You can get extraordinary amounts of information out of things if you only look at them in the right sort of way. And they don't have to be spectacular. You don't have to have a dinosaur skull to get excited by it, because you see things like this and you explore them to their full potential. And it just opens up a whole new world, not just of things that we haven't seen before, but answers to riddles and mysteries that had been there before we started looking. So it's not the full story, it's not the full answers, but this is something that we just wanted to share with you because it's a really exciting little development, and I can't wait to get more of the huge box of worms into the electron microscope and see what else we can learn from it. Because my guess is that aside from things which actually have the full soft tissue with the proboscis and everything, when it comes to the cuticle preservation, this is probably going to end up being the most important fauna known from anywhere at this stage. It's just so diverse and we've got so much detail in it. All right then, I will leave it there. Thank you again for listening, and we'll be back with more interesting stuff, including ones that I haven't forgotten about going back to Dickinsonia. Hopefully we'll both have time to do this sort of discussion fairly soon, hopefully. A few things coming up in the next few days which are going to be busy, but we'll do our best for you. Bye for now.